Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I hope you're having a great day. I got a request for a Shiba Inu painting, so I painted this strapping young lad today, and I'm pretty excited with how it turned out. It's a little bit of a longer painting than I've done in a while. It was about a couple hours plus the time it took to create the sketch. So I'm just going to condense that down into a shorter amount of time so you can see it from start to finish. But before I get into that, I did want to mention my website, CoreyFrankCreates.com. It's the best way to get in touch with me and learn more about what I do. You can sign up for my weekly email newsletter there, and in return get access to my one-page, no-brainer watercolor supplies buying guide. It's just a PDF with links to products I would recommend, which can be really helpful, especially when you're first starting out. I also have my online art shop on there, as well as my online courses for when you're ready to dive deeper into watercolor. So I'd love for you to go check that out. Again, it is CoreyFrankCreates.com. All right, without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this painting. So since this is a longer painting, I do have a sketch down, and if you want to see the reference image I used, it's linked in the description. It's from unsplash.com. They have royalty-free images on there. So I am using my size 8 round brush for the beginning of this because it has more bristles, so I can turn it on the side, cover wider areas at once. And I'm using the wet into wet technique, so I've laid down a little bit of water and then I go over with the paint. So we have wet paint on a wet surface. It tends to create more flow. You have feathered edges and it just spreads really easily. This is really great for when you're first getting started, because generally with watercolors, I recommend starting with lighter, looser washes of color, and then as you get further along, you start adding layers over the top once that bottom layer dries, and then you get a little more detailed with it. You start adding more paint. Now, I did go ahead, even while this was still a little damp, start adding darker color. I started out with black. I have an ivory black paint in my palette, but generally, even when an image has black color in it, I really like using Payne's Gray. It's a very, very dark, almost navy midnight blue. You can kind of tell there with the lighter color how it has that blue tone to it. But when you get it really, really dark, it just creates a very rich color. I prefer it even to just the pure black. So you're welcome to use that if you are wanting to get really dark tones. I think the Payne's Gray is excellent for that. So for those looser washes where I was just getting general color blocked in and kind of trying to have a little bit of a feathered edge to suggest that sort of fur-like texture, I let that dry, and it dries really quick where I live at. It's a pretty dry climate, so if you live somewhere that's more humid, you may have to wait a little longer. But I didn't have to wait long at all, so I could just kind of continue painting. And I started going in with this much darker Payne's Gray. I'm still using that larger brush, you can see. I really like larger round brushes because they're multi-purpose. You can turn them on their side for larger areas, covering larger areas. But then if you stay right on the tip, you can get decent detail as well. Now, of course, when I get into more detailed areas, I will switch to a smaller brush. I realized there were a couple parts of my sketch that were just a little off. Typically, before I even start painting, I want to have my sketch locked in. But this time, there I showed my smaller brush. This is a size 0 round brush, very tiny, very few bristles, great for doing detail. But as I was saying, there were a couple spots I noticed after I had started painting where my sketch just was slightly off with placement of things, and particularly where that sort of white fur kind of went up underneath the eye. It was a little too high, so I had to kind of fix that. And then also the eye itself on the left side was moved a little too far to the left, I believe. So typically I take much more time with a sketch and make sure it's fully accurate and proportion-wise and placement of things before I start painting. I rushed forward a little bit with this one just because I had a time constraint, so I wound up having to sort of fix things as I was painting. That's not the ideal situation. You don't necessarily want to be doing that. You want your sketch to be fully accurate before you start applying paint. But I made it work, and I am now using my detail brush to really focus in on certain areas to add those little kind of individual looking hairs. It's really nice with watercolor. You can kind of switch back and forth, having certain areas of the painting that are a little more loose, maybe don't have as much detail, and then having a lot of really tight detail in other areas. So like the ears, that fur has a kind of few more details. The eyes definitely are much more detailed. The eyes, when you add those, just really help kind of bring the image to life. So I did want to spend a decent amount of time on those, making sure that they were as close to the image as possible. So using that detail brush and applying, I used some burnt umber for the brown tone in the eye, and then of course the Payne's gray for the really dark color. And again, just starting to use some of that really fine detail, taking advantage of the tip. I did have a little bit of accidental paint splatter. I'm a bit of a messy painter, so sometimes that happens. I'll accidentally flick paint even when I don't want to. But at the end, you'll see that I do wind up flicking paint intentionally, which is a sort of part of my signature style. So, all right, moving on here, so really I worked mostly in those areas that are kind of looser, larger, and then started tightening up and really spending a lot more time on those eyes and that nose. That's really where the majority of my time was spent. And I realized too, kind of throughout painting, that the nose had a couple things that weren't quite right with it proportion-wise. So I kind of spent some time on it and then had to ultimately use the lifting technique a little later. And the lifting technique is sort of like erasing with watercolor. You're generally not going to get back to a pure white of the paper, but you can take a clean brush, really make sure there's no other paint color in it, and then kind of dab the excess water off on your towel and then run over very gently the part of the painting that you want to kind of somewhat erase or lift the paint off the surface. So you'll do that, then you'll take a towel or a rag and just blot that up, and do that multiple times very gently so that you don't damage the surface of your paper until you get back to as light of a tone as possible. Again, you're probably not going to get back to that pure white color. So I'll point out when I start doing that, but for now, again, just like refining details, making sure the shading is nice and dark. There were a couple areas where my burnt sienna, which is kind of that rusty orange color, just weren't quite as dark as I would have liked. So there's a couple times where I add that there, adding those little kind of fine hairs around the muzzle and the nose. Again, just kind of bumps up that sort of realistic quality a little bit. And since there we go. That's where I did that lifting technique. You can see I got the page fairly light, and then kind of went back and sort of readjusted where the nostrils on the nose needed to be, and those kind of details there as well. So something about watercolor that's really important and different from other mediums is you want to try and maintain your highlights as much as possible. So like with paints such as acrylic and watercolor, you generally add your highlights at the end when the paint is mostly dried, where you just put your white kind of on the spots where the highlights are. With watercolor, you have to do the opposite. Basically, you have to paint around the lights and make sure you don't cover them up. So that's just something to remember. You're almost working in reverse. And now I did go ahead and take a creative liberty. Was requested that I have a Shiba Inu in the red and black lumberjack pattern. So the original image doesn't have that, but I went ahead and just kind of very loosely painted that in there. I didn't necessarily want it to be very detailed. I just wanted to suggest that pattern. And I wanted to have a really nice dark red, so I used cadmium red deep and then the Payne's gray, just to really bump up that contrast as well, where you have more neutral, kind of earthy tones on the dog, and then that very bright red just really stands out. Nice color pop. And then I added some details where the fur kind of goes over the top of that sort of little jacket or bandana kind of thing he has on. Realized there were a couple spots on the ears that needed to be darkened up. Again, just kind of adding those final details. A lot of time if you step away for a bit and then come back to a painting, you'll realize, oh, this needs to be updated or fixed. So I did that, and then here's my splatter. I just have a lot of paint and a lot of water in the brush, and then I just kind of tap the brush over or flick it against my finger, add that signature with the detail brush, and there you have it. It's all done. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Go ahead and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. Until my next one, be kind to yourself, be kind to others, God bless, and I will see you soon.